This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Panthea Lee is a principal and lead designer at Reboot.org, a social impact firm dedicated to inclusive development and accountable governance. Panthea is focused on the practical applications of ethnography and systems thinking in delivering effective international development and governance programs. Prior to co-founding Reboot.org, Panthea worked with the UNICEF Innovations team, where she managed the development of a real-time data platform to support child rights advocacy in Iraq and mobile learning tools in Suriname and Sudan. She also contributed to the launch of Palestine's first open-source software community. Before joining UNICEF, Panthea worked as a journalist covering access to information, press freedom, and sustainable development. Panthea writes and speaks regularly about her experiences around the world. She has presented at A Better World by Design, Microsoft's Social Computing Symposium, and TEDxDumbo. She has lectured at Columbia University, Harvard University, and the School of Visual Arts, among others. And her work has been featured in The Atlantic, MIT Innovations Journal, Touchpoint, the Journal of Service Design, Core 77, TechPresident and Fast Company. I spoke with Panthea in New York. Hi there, Panthea. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Where do we find you sitting today in all of your travels?
I am actually back in New York at the moment.
Super cool. And we're talking now in November of 2015. And so I'm assuming that it's a little chilly by now.
It is a little chilly, but we've been having a bit of an Indian summer, which is actually very nice.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Panthea, you are one of the principals at an organization called Reboot. Why don't we just start with you telling us about what Reboot is and how you got it started?
Sure. So Reboot's founding vision was to change the way that governments and major development institutions approach policymaking and service delivery. So small task. And
I was going to say, that's the smallest mission I've probably heard on this podcast.
I mean, so, we do this in a couple of ways. We act as consultants to and implementers for these institutions, working across the program cycle from research and strategy through to implementation, using approaches that draw from the disciplines of design and ethnography and political science. And so sort of through this process, we help integrate citizen voices and local context as a foundational part of that design process, not just as an afterthought. And so these project results then become the evidence base upon which we can advocate for new and better approaches. And so we then try to leverage our access to senior leaders in government and development agencies to advocate on the why and how these organizations need to evolve. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do. We're
going to spend the next 30 minutes unpacking that nutshell, I think. Simple question. Were you sitting there one day? I know you worked for UNICEF Innovations before, and you've had a couple other cool assignments. Were you sitting there one day and you're like, aha, oh my gosh, this is the answer. We need to do this differently? Or how did the idea for Reboot have its genesis for you?
Sure. I actually didn't know that I wanted to work in development. And I think that my experience with UNICEF Innovation was really formative. It was a wonderful experience and had a massive impact on me. But, I think like many of us, we are quite skeptical of the aid and development industry in general. And so, having worked in the UN and having seen a lot of our projects and the way that aid money was getting spent, we thought, surely there must be a way to do things better. I remember there was a project that I was working on with us in Sudan, actually. And I was in charge of designing essentially the scale up of this program that I had been involved in. And so I went to visit the villages that we were implementing in and realized that after a couple of years, there was not a lot to show for this program.
Nothing like showing up a couple of years later and saying, what did we do?
Exactly. And so, we had spent a lot of money on this OLPC program, and we had 3 laptops. We had invested in developing sort of educational software. There were a couple of animated PowerPoints. And I think the kicker there really for me was, for other reasons, we had a press team with us. And so we're in this village and realizing that we don't really sort of have much going on. And we have these journalists that decided to sort of pluck these kids from this village and place them not against sort of the school or the housing structures, but against the sort of barren landscape, and started sort of taking photos of them with these broken OLPCs to write this sort of glowing story afterwards about this educational program. And, and then this sort of sounds like it's out of a movie, but this little boy walks by with his donkey. And so the journalist sort of plucks the kid up, places her on a donkey and, with the broken OLPC, and like keeps taking these photos. And I just remember at that time sort of feeling sick to my stomach, and thinking,
sure,
gosh, there must be a better way of doing this. And I had worked in the private sector previously, designing products and services that people sort of wanted and needed and would spend money to buy, and thought, there must be a better way of designing public services and development programs in that same way. And so that's when, after some time, I had met my co-founder, and we decided to start Reboot, to try and bring some of those approaches to the development space.
That's a powerful story, and one that many, many, many of the people listening to this podcast can relate to. Either
Sure.
the undelivery of aid or the unfulfilled promise of aid, or as you're describing it, the juxtaposition of how do you report on how this money was used and make it look good, right?
Right.
Take me through what your business model looks like. I've reviewed your website. I've learned as much about Reboot as I can, and you do a little bit of everything, as you said. You've got consultancy, you've got implementation, you've got sort of looking at the back end research evaluation. How do you do that differently? I noticed that one of the things you focus mostly on is being embedded, being a part of that inclusiveness. So what does that look like? Are your clients giving you a contract as Reboot, and then you're putting a team there, or are you going and working in the organization, or what exactly does that look like?
That's a great question, and one that I don't know that we've entirely figured out just yet either. I think when we first started, we had mentors that said to us, gosh, that sounds like a crazy business model. Why would you go and, most organizations either pick, they do the research and the strategy, or they do the implementations, different cost structures, different business models, whatnot. But, it was always very important to us to sort of work across that cycle, because we thought by doing the field research ourselves and doing the design, we'd be better implementers, and doing the implementation sort of gives us greater insight into the field realities that inform design. And so, I think we've been constantly experimenting. I mean, most of our work at the moment is, we take contracts from these organizations, and then sort of through that process, we try and introduce new ways of doing things. So, drawing on user-centered design, drawing on applied ethnography. And so that's the majority of our projects. But I think, as a young organization, we have the privilege of asking ourselves all the time, sort of at this point in our growth, at the scale that we're at with the experience that we've had, what is the way that we can have, the most impact? And so we've also, we do some pro bono work with but nonprofits, civil society organizations that we really believe in. We've given out grants, not just sort of re-granting through larger programs, but, of our own resources to see, what that might look like. We've embedded staff in different organizations to try and see, is that a model where we can help these organizations really change their processes and ways of doing things? And so we're constantly experimenting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I like the constant experimentation. It's agile, right? I mean, it fits well within the context of just sort of the professional universe many people want to work in these days. It's adaptive. So is there a way for you to characterize what's the lever that Reboot is hoping to use to accelerate these types of changes? You characterize it well, I think, when you're talking, in your private sector experience. Hey, you put a product or a service on the market, and if people want to pay you money for that, then great. You continue development, it moves forward. If they don't want to, you shelve it or you put it away and you find a different way to try to sell it. How does that work? And maybe it's a two-part question, right? How does that work with public institutions? You're so often caught up in a bidding structure. You're so often caught up in, these rigid procurement processes. What's your process for working around that? And then, what are you putting on the table? You're saying, hey, this is the lever we're going to move for you.
That's a great question. The way that we look at new opportunities, and we're a small organization, so there's opportunity cost to everything that we do.
Absolutely. Every time you go put yourself on a project or everything, you can't go do another project, right?
Exactly. We're not doing something else, and so we run it through this sort of matrix, and the very sort of the number one criteria, the one that has the highest weighting, is who's sitting on the other side of the table. Not like what the organization is, but who's the actual person. What are their values? What do they believe in? Because we're coming in as entryists, trying to introduce sometimes radically, depending on the organization, radically different ways of doing things. And so, do we agree that we need to invest in being embedded in wherever we're working for a year? Do we, because that has lots of other, cost, resource implications, whatnot. Do we believe that we need to have regular reviews and, drastically change the scope of work if needed, which obviously requires a lot more time investment from our counterparts at donor organizations, whatnot, that, the HR incentives at their organizations don't really encourage. And so I think we try and take a look at who's the other person, who's the person on the other side of the table, and are we going to take the same calls in terms of values and approaches and how we want to implement these projects. And so I think it might not be a great answer because everyone wants a sort of scalable solution, but I think individuals are our biggest lever, as it were. And so beyond sort of their values and their principles, do they also have the political clout within their organizations to try and push through new approach, a new way of thinking? Because every project for us is also not just about the project. It's about that project then becoming part of an evidence base to then push for sort of larger change, process change, policy change within their institution.
Again, every time you answer a question, I have like four things. First, unpack what an entryist is for me. I'm going to admit to you, full stop, when I was going through your website, that is the first time I've ever read that word. Tell me what an entryist is, and why that's an important definition for you.
Sure. So entryism to us is, I think it comes from Trotsky. And so it's basically sort of, it's a strategy by which we essentially try and infiltrate, sounds like a wrong term. Let's say you collaborate with or partner with. We collaborate with organizations whose sort of fundamental approaches and ways of doing things may be sort of quite different from what we believe in, and sort of work with them from the inside to try and change their way of doing things. We don't have to use that term. And I think
sure, it's interesting. You've put it out there, and it's on your, sort of it's a part of your formulation, your mantra as you're putting out there to the world. I found it quite interesting. So I wanted to know what your particular definition of it was. Tell us about, maybe, if you can, maybe one of the assignments that Reboot has worked on recently where you felt like, wow, we've really moved the lever here. We've really had a success, or this has created change in a way that we think is adaptable, scalable, other people could use it.
Sure. Some of our recent work around public finance has been, I think, really fascinating. So we have an office in Nigeria, and there we've been working with the World Bank and the government on a portfolio of projects around social accountability, citizen participation, whatnot. But one of the projects that I think has been most fascinating for me was we were asked to essentially develop a new methodology for evaluating public financial management systems. Our counterpart at the bank basically came to us and said, listen, we've been using these same approaches, PIFA frameworks, whatnot, for decades, and it hasn't gotten us very far. There's so much that these standard frameworks that assess, government PFM systems based on, OECD norms of how a system should work, these frameworks don't capture. Surely there's a better way. And so they asked us to essentially develop a new methodology. And so we brought on sort of some experts and essentially sort of developed and piloted this approach that blends applied ethnography and public economics to look at both the sort of formal and the informal factors, such as sort of social networks, to examine just how exactly these systems work, not just what is broken and needs fixing. And so our counterparts knew that, quote unquote, corruption was happening, but had no idea how. And so, or at what scale, or what were the specific mechanisms at a very granular level in which this was happening. And so, our work there led to some pretty surprising and interesting results. And I think part of that illustrated the constraints that these government officials were facing as they inherited sort of crippled civil services, low capacity, ministries, departments, agencies, whatnot, and how they worked to sort of circumvent them in ways that, again, sort of based on our formal systems of evaluation, look like corruption, but in actual fact were these, individuals' way of just getting around the systems and the constraints that they had inherited.
Essentially getting things done.
Right, exactly. Getting things done in the best way that they know how, but then sort of getting penalized for it, by our standard metrics. And so that led to much more, this was sort of part of a significant development policy credit that the bank was considering for this particular state. And it led to much more productive policy dialogues. It led to reforms that are actually still ongoing in terms of how the state is handling infrastructure sort of spending and procurement. And the results have been very well received in the bank and stirred up internal sort of dialogue about how they might adapt their methods and integrate some of these approaches. So that to us has been really exciting.
That's super. Take me back to the beginning of that project. First of all, it's juicy. It's huge. There's huge implications of what this could mean, as you were just saying, not only in Nigeria itself, but at the World Bank level. Did you call up the World Bank and say, hey, we think this is a good idea? Did you know somebody who knew somebody who said, hey, we'd like a proposal? Was this, what was the genesis of this work? Because
so we had already been working on a project with the World Bank. I think this was our third project with them in Nigeria. And so we'd already been working on a couple of projects. And I think those started honestly early on. I think people hired us because we were cheaper than the next guy. I think early on we significantly discounted a lot of our services because
it's a big hidden secret that it's a race to the bottom.
Well, because I think in the first couple of years, exactly, we knew that as a new organization with 2 people and an ugly website, no one was going to entrust us to do these big important projects, and so we thought, well, we can't compete on experience. We can't compete on track record. So the only thing we can do is compete on cost. And so early on, and we just knew that there were things that people wouldn't pay for. Why spend 3 months doing field research when, we could just do like 1 week and interview, government officials in the national capital. And so we significantly discounted our services, got our foot in the door and started sort of demonstrating why these more immersive, these more participatory approaches just led to better results. And we also significantly invested in communications. Development is about change. To get people to buy onto that requires good storytelling, but we don't pay for it. And so no one paid for communications designers, but we knew that was going to be a significant part of this advocacy model. And so we told really great stories. We produced reports that we had, clients come back and said, gosh, I want to blow this up and frame this and put it in my office. We said, that's great. And so, that was some of our early work with the bank in Nigeria. And someone sort of senior knew one of the project leaders, essentially, that we were working with and said, these guys seem scrappy. They seem like they are looking at things from a fresh perspective. I wonder if we could pair them up with PFM experts to develop something new, because we knew nothing about public finance when we first started. And so that's kind of how it happened. They sort of saw our skill set and did a bit of matchmaking. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great story. Thanks for sharing it. Part of the Reboot story is inclusiveness and collaboration and let's get this done together.
Sure.
How would you take that process that you have, that you just described, or this inclusiveness that you're describing, and share it with others, or share with other organizations or other individuals? Or, how do you go about that so that others can, sort of pick up the torch and, implement it and start to scale this, in a more rapid fashion, or forget rapidness, just start to use this and continue this work in other areas?
Yeah. I think that we've been trying to capture and document our approaches, in implementation manuals, different guides, whatnot, targeted at different communities. So we've produced one for sort of media development folks with Internews. We've produced one for the open government community with the Hewlett Foundation. We've done a couple of these sort of guides, and to essentially sort of lay out a structured process, because I think inclusiveness is easy to talk about, but how do you actually integrate that into the existing processes and the sort of contracting mechanisms by which we all have to do our work? Mm-hmm. And I think that, people might say, wow, user-centered design is great, but you can't adapt private sector practices to the public sector and expect that to work out of the box. And so I think a lot of what we've been doing is trying to sort of translate these approaches for designing good consumer services and adapting them to sort of thornier politics and the unique and often sort of, Byzantine procurement processes of public sector work. So I think that's been part of it. And then I think we've been really excited to be part of different conversations, such as the Doing Development Differently community. We're honored to be sort of one of the organizations at those initial meetings that helped shape that manifesto, and as sort of one of the few implementing organizations there to sort of shape a set of principles that, again, ultimately aren't really anything new. We know that these principles are important, but just, building that community of practitioners within different organizations that are committed to driving these forward in their organizations.
Excellent. I love your thoroughness in your thought process and in the answers you're providing my questions. It sounds like that you've really spent a lot of time not only thinking about this, but actually doing it.
By the way, is a nice way of putting it. Usually, I think the team perceives it as long-windedness.
I thought you were about to say "bang your head against the wallness."
Okay, that too.
So, are you at Reboot? You and your co-founder, are you practitioners first? Are you running the organization first? Are you doing are basically you walking the fence still? What's your daily, so your day-to-day look like right now?
Sure. So we've split things up in that I focus on overseeing our project work, and he focuses on leading the organization, effectively functioning as our CEO. We both do project work, but that's sort of the division of responsibilities, I guess, we've laid out. And so
we should probably say his name is Zach as well. We don't have to keep calling him the other guy.
Yes, Zach is amazing. Zach's brilliant. And he, helps us set the vision and articulate how exactly it is that we're going to get there. So he has a set of skills that I aspire to have, but don't.
If you had your druthers, would you stay immersed in the project work? Is that where you find the most enjoyment, or are you really excited about growing an organization?
I think the project work is where I'm most excited. And it's, I love spending a day doing, like after our team has done a month-long research sprint and just sort of wrestling with the data. I really enjoy interviews. I really enjoy that process of discovery, but it's not what I get to do a lot of anymore. We have a great team that does all that work. And I think more and more I'm finding myself, doing it's a lot of emails. It's a lot of conferences. It's a lot of consensus building. I think the day-to-day work that, we find ourselves doing to try and, to keep the organization, keep the machine running. So that's a lot of what I'm involved in now. I'm usually working across a couple of different projects at a time.
You talked earlier that, part of your decision-making process for taking on a new assignment is, a matrix of values and ideologies and just making sure that you can work together. Beyond the opportunity cost, the work that you have to pass up because either there's not a good fit or you don't have enough hands to handle it. This is always one of my favorite questions as well. When has something not worked out? When have you fallen on your face? And just either the process or the project just kind of didn't work out the way you wanted to? And what did you do to either learn from that or pick yourself back up and go look for the next project?
I think the reason that we do have such a stringent process for evaluating new projects now is because we fell on our face a couple of times, at the beginning. And certainly no process is perfect, and we're not assuming that now. But I think some of the biggest mistakes have come from being sort of too eager at the outset. Everything sounds good on paper, and sort of not having done that due diligence, or not having engaged enough with, the counterparts, commissioning bodies, whatnot, before jumping into a project. But I think also something that we've also learned to do is to, rather than, just say no, is to talk people away from solutions that they may be really excited about, and offering, we won't do that project that you want us to do, but we'd be willing to do this other one to test some of the assumptions underlying this thing that you want us to build, or this thing that you want us to make. That's been helpful for us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Oh, is there a particular example that you might be able to share, or a story where you did start down any one of those paths where you said, "Oh, this is exciting," and we've gone through our matrix, and we're investing in this project, but then here you are 6 months later, and it's just not going anywhere. This just isn't happening.
There's this project that we worked on in Libya that essentially sort of we were brought in by the Libyan government. This is after the revolution. The Libyan government, the new Libyan government, and the UN's support mission in Libya to help the country develop mobile voter registration and administration platform. And the idea there was, the country was still in a period of significant turmoil, and due to its geographic sort of vastness, the thinking was that a digital solution would be able to overcome some of those barriers. And it was a hugely challenging project for many reasons. Security constraints at the time, a new democracy sort of trying to wrestle with how to set up these new processes, and the political isolation law also meant that many senior civil servants under Gaddafi had been purged from the government. And so you had just low capacity, or just, different individuals working in government. So it was hugely challenging there. And I think that the project was successful in terms of we achieved the project results. We built the world's first voter registration and administration platform, whatnot. It worked during the elections. That was all great. And, hopefully we tried to do what very little we could to help a country in a transitional state inch towards a better future. But I think that it was hugely, in many other ways, I think that we were not able to execute the process in a way that we thought would lead to sort of the most robust solutions and results in a way that was, easiest for all citizens to use, or we wrestled with that. We knew that there would be differences of opinion in approaches to design and development when we first started, and that was totally fine. We had all talked about that, and I think sort of in the moment, but once we were there, it was wrestling with these differences of opinion, and also recognizing for ourselves too. It was trying to take our own ego out of it. Their country, change on their timeline, so it was not the most inclusive platform. it was not the most participatory process we'd ever executed. But at the same time, again, it's not our country. And so perhaps we were just expecting and, wanting a scale of change that was not feasible on that timeline. And also who are we to say, what is the best solution? And so I think that project is one that we sort of wrestled a lot with internally around, was it a success?
What are you most excited about for the next 5 years? I know that Reboot has sort of recently relaunched you relaunched your website, and that was a moment for you to say, here's what we're going to concentrate on in the future. But what about you, either personally or as an organization? Are you excited about changes that you see happening, innovations you see coming down the pipe, or projects that you are excited to propose and implement out there?
Yeah. I think what's been exciting for us as an organization over the past few months is we've had a couple of great partners. One of our counterparts, Janet Haven at Open Society Foundations, at the end of her project, she said, why are you guys hiding behind your advocacy mission? Like, why not lead with that? And, her and a couple of others that we've been working with have been sort of encouraging us to stop just trying to get the projects and then, sneak your approach in there, lead with that. And we've been trying to, based on their encouragement, trying to figure out just what is the mechanism, what is a model by which we might do that. And so I think our latest experiment that we hope to start next year is we're in the process of establishing essentially a fund, a donor collaborative fund, to essentially sort of support, enable development programming in ways that we think, based on what industry experts agree on, based on our own experience, how we think it should be done. So, interventions that recognize the political complexity of doing good development, that essentially provides funding to civil society groups and governments that are willing to and eager to essentially adopt a process to developing and implementing programs that agree on a set of principles that we've developed over our past 5 years, and then to bring in an external evaluator. And we have some sort of great potential partners that essentially sort of want to evaluate this process and say, okay, we all know these principles are important. We know these processes are the things that we should follow, but can they evaluate it in a systematic way to help us understand the relationship and the linkages between principles and processes and results, to help us understand for ourselves too, what of these values that we espouse, which ones are more important than others? And, that's sort of grossly oversimplified, but that's something that we're pretty excited about in the new year.
That's nice. I like that. I love the development fund idea.
It's not new. Lots of folks have tried it. But
Sure. Mm-hmm.
This is we're excited about sort of trying it in this way.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. Final question for you. You're connected to an extraordinary network and to, probably hundreds and hundreds of organizations. Is there any piece of technology or process or idea or thing that's out there that you'd love to get a shout out to, or you're like, wow, I want to be a part of that, or, I think people should really pay attention to that now? Like, what are you geeking out on right now? It could be more than one. You could give me a laundry list if you'd like, but usually people say, this week I'm psyched on this particular opportunity or something.
Yeah, I don't know that I have one. I think the paper probably came out a couple of years ago at this point was the Lamp Pritchett, Matt Andrews paper on PDIA, which stands for problem-driven iterative adaptation. And I'm not sure when it came. I think it was a couple of years ago. But I think what was really exciting about that and the conversations around DDD and other things that has since sort of, inspired and pushed forward is it, I think, selfishly perhaps helped give us credibility for a lot of the things that we had been testing with, experimenting, and trying to put into words that were more appealing to, acceptable to the development establishment. And so I think that's been exciting to see. I've also been really excited by, and, we've been trying to learn how to build upon the work of really great development anthropologists. I think earlier on had, read the David Mosses, the Albert Hirschmans, James Fergusons. And I think now we're now trying to experiment with how to do institutional ethnography of development institutions. And I'm learning a lot from development anthropologists that are very established and have been very generous with their time and helping us sort of wrestle with how to walk the line between being a critical observer of these organizations and also working from within them to try and recommend ways to change. And so we're working on one of a major sort of multilateral donor and one of a UN agency. So institutional ethnography is something that I'm geeking out on and trying to understand sort of both the theory and how to translate that into practice.
Panthea, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Really appreciate you having us on.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.